we met when I was pregnant, and so I was kind of very much in that kind of vulnerable population had I been living in Flint. Yesterday was my son's second birthday. It was my son that I was pregnant with when I met Dr. Mona just over 2 years ago. And it was really her kind of passionate indignation, but also kind of indefatigable optimism that things could change and that things must change for the women who were expectant mothers in Flint, for the parents in Flint, and most of all for the children of Flint. And so I really want to start kind of there, Dr. Mona, and ask kind of why that kind of ultimately led you to write this book. And then I want to get into kind of the substance of the book. But kind of why did you have to take your anger and your optimism and pour it into this really terrific read?
Thank you, Chelsea. And I also want to echo the thanks, especially to you for giving your time away from your family, your 2 young children, to be here and to share the story. So I'm grateful to you, and I'm grateful to everybody else who came out here to hear about this book. So this book was conceived out of that anger, out of that optimism, and out of our work. The work in Flint is ongoing. It is an ongoing crisis. And when I started this effort of writing this book over 2 years ago, I knew that the nation's attention would have left Flint by now, as rightly so, because there's lots of stuff happening in our nation that needs our urgent attention. But we knew, and I knew, that our crisis was a long-term crisis, and that we would have long-term issues, and that I needed a way to bring out a flashlight and put it back on the city of Flint, not only to share the terrible lessons that occurred so that they never happen again, but also to share what we are doing for the kids in Flint. We are doing absolutely awesome stuff in Flint right now, things that aren't being done anywhere else in this country on behalf of children, things that we should be doing for children everywhere, things that are science-based, like universal preschool and literacy programs and healthcare access and mental health care access and nutrition resources. These are things that all kids need. And because of our crisis, we've been able to put things in place to promote children's development. And that's also very much why I wrote this book and why I wanted to share this story, because there's lessons that are applicable to children everywhere. You know, there's Flints everywhere. There are children everywhere waking up to very similar crises, be it environmental injustice or loss of democracy or austerity or racism or discrimination or any disparity you can think of. It's all over. So I'm hoping that the lessons that we put into place can be shared with children all over.
And all of those injustices collapsed onto Flint. And one of the things that we briefly talked about on our way onto the stage was how much history you include, and kind of why it was so important to you to include kind of the antecedents of racism, of kind of a lack of democracy, of disinvestment, disregard. And you talk about the many villains. So I want to talk about the heroes of the story, but I want to start with the villains because I'd rather end with the heroes. So could you just talk a little bit about the villains in the story? Because there is real culpability here. There is blame to be assigned. There is fault to be called out. And there is certainly an accounting to be had. So could you talk about some of the historic villains and also unfortunately, some of the more recent ones?
Yeah, so there is quite a bit of history in this book. There's public health history and the history of lead and the use of lead in this country. There's a lot of family history, my personal Iraqi-American immigrant family history. The history of the city I grew up in, Royal Oak, Michigan. I have one of my buddies from Royal Oak right here. So it's important for us to recognize this history because we walk through this history every single day, yet we don't often understand how this history contributes to where we are and to the cities we're in and to the problems that we are facing. I'll give you one example, the history of Flint. So who knows what Flint was famous for before this water crisis? Cars. So Flint was the birthplace of cars. The birthplace of General Motors was in Flint. At one point, Flint had the highest per capita income in the country. Can you imagine? People in Flint made the most money anywhere in the country. And because of that, we had some of the best public health indices, the best schools, the unions, incredible worker activism was born in Flint. But then we suffered from decades and decades of disinvestment, unemployment, poverty, purposeful racism, where our neighborhoods were redlined and blockbusted, and there was desegregation, and all of these policies that were unconscious and conscious put into place a city that was isolated, a city that was near bankrupt, a city that then became under emergency management. So in Michigan, we have this crazy law. If you're near bankrupt, the state can just kind of swoop in and usurp democracy. And because of that history that created this situation, we lost democracy. So Flint literally lost democracy and was under the control of the state. So that's kind of villain number one. And it was the state's decision under this emergency manager rule to switch our water source. They determined that the water we had been getting for half a century from the Great Lakes. So we have Michiganders here. Where's all my Michiganders? Awesome, so many Michiganders. Okay, so how do we describe where we're from in Michigan? Hold up your hand. Okay, so we are the mitten state, right? Because we are surrounded by what? Water. So Michigan is surrounded by the Great Lakes. So we are literally surrounded by 20% of the fresh water in the world. And for half a century, here's Flint. So we point to where we're from. So Flint is literally in the middle of that mitten, and we've been getting fresh, pre-treated Great Lakes water for half a century. But under emergency management, it was deemed too expensive, and the focus was austerity. Big government was a problem. Let's cut. And it was decided that it was just too expensive to get for this poor, predominantly minority city to get pre-treated fresh water. So we started drawing water from the local Flint River, and it wasn't being treated properly, and that created that perfect storm for the lead that was in our plumbing to leach out of our plumbing into our drinking water and into the bodies of our children. So the culprits are the state, because that's who was in charge. The culprits are the folks in our drinking water department at the state level who knew how to treat water and were told they should have treated water properly but didn't. There's culprits at the State Department of Health who knew that children's lead levels were increasing but didn't do anything. So there's charges against a lot of these people. There's actually over 15 criminal charges in Flint, and some of those also include homicide charges. Not only did we have population-wide lead exposure, we had one of the largest outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease, which is a pneumonia that usually elderly immunocompromised people get because of this water source change. And there's homicide charges against these villains. So those are the clearly identifiable villains. But the real villains, kind of what the title says, what the eyes don't see, are harder to see because they are the ongoing effects of, say, racism and deindustrialization and corporate greed, which really put lead in our plumbing in the first place, which created the city of Flint to be kind of the shell of its former self to its day.
Dr. Mona, why do you think there was such a resistance from people who should know better, from the public health community, from scientists, from your fellow physicians, and others, to recognize the rising levels of lead and to not be willing to look for the link to kind of the water source switch? Because one of the things that really struck me in reading your book was the persistent dismissal because so much was being done to deal with lead paint, and so much was being done to kind of effectively like exhume lead paint from soil after decades of kind of the corrosive effect of lead kind of leaching into soil. And yet somehow there was this mental break in being able to make the not too far leap into, if you are inhaling lead and it's bad for you, if you are effectively eating lead, and admittedly some kids actually eat lead because they eat the paint off
It's
the
sweet.
wall.
It's sweet.
It's sweet.
The paint
It tastes
is
good.
sweet.
Yeah, white lead apparently is quite sweet.
It's true.
That you wouldn't also be vulnerable to lead in water. Like, what do you, or how do you explain that?
So that also gets to my title, so what the eyes don't see. So when I was a pediatric resident in training in Detroit at Children's Hospital, Michigan, there was a professor of mine, Professor Sarniak, who would always yell at us when we couldn't figure out a diagnosis. Yeah, and it's in the book, and he always says we'd go through a differential, which is like a list of things that could be contributing to a diagnosis or a condition. And we would exhaust that long list of different things, and we wouldn't get the right answer. We wouldn't get the diagnosis. And he would say, the eyes don't see what the mind doesn't know. And in all my years of treating children with lead poisoning in Detroit and in Flint, I never knew, and I have a public health background and environmental health background. I never even knew there was lead in our plumbing before this crisis. So I didn't even know. I didn't even know that it could be a source. So very much public health has been almost brainwashed to only think about, say, lead paint and lead soil and lead dust, because they are still common, and those are common ways that kids get exposed to lead. But lead in water is even more evil. It's something you ingest. It's in a vehicle made for ingestion. We are meant to drink water. And it also impacts a much younger and a much more developmentally age group. So in Flint, our breastfeeding rates are low, just like in many urban centers. And moms make powdered formula. And you make powdered formula by mixing that powder with tap water. And babies like warm bottles. So they get warm tap water from their sink, often in the middle of the night when there's been a lot of pooling and stasis of water in the plumbing. And they mix that warm water with powdered formula. And that was all lead-laced water, that lead-laced warm water mixed with that powdered formula. And it was going directly inside a population of children that were most developmentally vulnerable. That is your age when your brain is developing, and they were getting hit hardest by this neurotoxin.
Well, so thankfully, Dr. Mona was not someone who was unwilling to open her eyes and kind of look at what was happening quite literally beneath the surface of the water. And yet one of the things that struck me in reading the book was how much kind of your original interest hinged on your best friend from high school, knowing kind of what questions to help you ask. And so while I'm really grateful that you stayed in touch with her and that she was so helpful, I also am slightly horrified that kind of we're reliant on the serendipity of kind of people in positions to ask part of the right questions, kind of knowing people in other positions to ask kind of the complementary questions so that we get more quickly kind of to the urgent answers that we need. All that being said, I am really grateful to your friend. So could you talk a little bit about kind of that moment of like, oh my God, like this is happening, and oh my God, like we have to do something.
Yeah. So absolutely. So people assume that I picked up on this crisis by seeing children in my clinic who had lead poisoning. But that is not true, because lead poisoning is known as a silent pediatric epidemic. We do not see the consequences of lead poisoning right away. It takes years, if not decades, to present. So I found out about lead in water at my house with a glass of wine in my hand because of this lady over here. Annie, raise your hand. So Annie is... Annie is an opera singer here in New York City. She runs something called Opera on Tap, where they sing at like bars and bring opera to the common folk. And she was, but she's originally from Royal Oak, Michigan, our hometown. And she was coming to town, and she texted me, I'm like, hey, I'm coming to town. I'm like, hey, come on over. Let's have a last minute, a barbecue. Come on over. And I texted another girlfriend. Her name is Elin. Can you come over? And she's like, okay, yeah, I'll bring my kids. I'll come over. So 2 high school girlfriends at my house. Haven't seen them for years, both musicians who happened to play in our wedding. And my other girlfriend, Elin, is a water expert, a drinking water expert, formerly with the EPA when Washington, D.C. had a very similar lead and water crisis. She is an expert on lead and water. And she's at my house. We're having a glass of wine, just girlfriends chatting, talking about kids. Our kids are running around. They're making a lot of noise. They're all little. They've got five of them under the age of 5, lots of noise. And we huddle in the corner. And Elin's like, hey, have you heard about the Flint water? I'm like, yeah, there was bacteria, but they treated it. And then there was too much chlorine, but it was okay. And I'm telling my patients to drink the water because the state says it's okay. I see patients every day, and I am reassuring them, do not waste your money on bottled water. If this is a poor city, that's fine. Like, how could the water not be okay? You turn your tap. There's people who check this. The water is okay. And she turns to me and she's like, Mona, the water is not okay. It's missing an important ingredient called corrosion control. And I'm like, oh, I have no idea what you're talking about. What is corrosion control? And she said, without corrosion control, there is going to be lead in the water. And when a pediatrician hears the word lead, when anybody with any public health background hears the word lead, there's no going back. It's just going forward. And that really kind of started my quest to see if that lead was getting into the bodies of our children.
And you found?
Yeah, so I tried to get that data from the state and from the county. So lead is something that's often part of surveillance systems. So we have surveillance systems for like flu and HIV. Lead is also tracked at the state and county level, blood lead levels of children. I tried to get that data because it was a big data set, and I couldn't get that data. So then we ran our own numbers in our hospital. Our public hospital in Flint is a children's hospital, which sees most of the kids in the area. And in record speed, we ran the data from our hospital, from our clinic, and found out that the percentage of children with elevated lead levels increased after our water switch, which was contrary to everything that was happening at the national level, the state level, and the city level, where children's lead levels have been coming down. And what we found was this alarming increase, but we also realized it was a gross underestimation of exposure because most kids weren't tested, and they weren't being tested at the right age.
And when you kind of began this quest, it was like you and your friend and your research assistant, effectively. And yet quite quickly and powerfully, you built a tribe of like-minded citizens, scientists, activists, religious leaders, to raise an alarm about what was happening and to mobilize to try to stop that, but also to do everything you could to ameliorate the effect on kids. Can you talk a little bit about how you built that coalition and how many people you kind of had to seek out, but also how many people started really coming to you?
Absolutely. So, the Flint story is a crisis, and it is a tragedy. But what I want you to go away with is the story of resistance and activism and teamwork and hope that we built. And that is a lesson that can be shared in so much of what is happening in our nation right now. So when I found out that my research showed this, I knew I needed a team. We all need teams. So often we think that the struggles we are fighting alone. But there's folks that are fighting those same struggles. And my best friend in this whole crisis was a water expert from Virginia Tech, Mark Edwards, this renowned water engineer from Virginia. And he couldn't have been more different than me. So he's a tall, white guy. He votes different than me. He looks different than me. He's an engineer. I'm like, engineers care about kids? Like, I thought pediatricians had a monopoly on caring about kids. But he really cared about kids. So I think that really kind of opened my eyes on the need to build a diverse team and a team of folks who are as different as possible as you, but really also care about the same thing. So we built that team with activists, with moms. We have an incredible religious pastor community in Flint, with other physicians in the state and in the city. And with that team standing behind me and next to me, we shared this data, and we went against the state. And they resisted, but finally they folded, and we were able to bring about the change.
And so now we're in the heroes part of the conversation. And not only do kind of heroes not always wear capes, sometimes they wear beautiful red dresses. Heroes also never stop, right? I think one of the defining features of of our true heroes is their persistence in the pursuit of what is right. And so I wonder if Dr. Mona, before we kind of open up the conversation more broadly, can you tell us what's happened in the last few months? Kind of what's the coda to the book? Kind of what is happening now? And how can people support your work? You know, talk a little bit about Flint Kids maybe and what else you're doing.
So I am not a hero. I'm a pediatrician. So I literally
we'll differ on that one.
I took an oath. I literally took an oath to protect children and to be an advocate for children and to stand up and be their healer and be their voice. I wish children could vote. Maybe we can work on that later. But it is our job to be their voice, especially in populations where their voice has been dismissed and ignored. And as a medical educator, that's what I teach my pediatricians in training, that this is your job to be an advocate. So I am privileged to do this work. I am blessed to wake up every day and to do this work for our kids. The heroes of the story are the people of Flint, who to this day are still on filtered and bottled water.
And maybe you can explain that,
yeah.
Even after the water switch.
So shortly after our press conference where we released this information, we switched back to treated water. We went back to treated Great Lakes water. But for 18 months, we were on this corrosive water, and that ate up our infrastructure. It ate up our lead pipes. So the folks at the EPA said it was like drinking through a lead-painted straw, almost like Russian roulette. You never knew when your drinking glass would be filled with a piece of lead paint or lead scale from those pipes. So because of our pipes were so messed up, they're being replaced, and this is awesome. So with a combination of federal funds and state funds, our damaged lead pipes are being replaced. And after that's done, we will only be the third city in the country to replace our lead pipes, which is amazing. Do you know which city has the most lead pipes in America? New York City. So New York City actually has the most lead pipes in America, but hopefully it's properly treated. I think it is, but the laws are really weak. We'll get to that. So our pipes are being replaced, and because we are doing that earth-moving infrastructure pipe work, that has the potential to disrupt the lead scale that's underneath. So that's why people still need to be on filters and bottled water. The bottled water was also the state-supplied bottled water, which ended, was really also helping with the affordability of water. Before we were a crisis of quality, Flint was a crisis of water affordability. The people of Flint were actually paying the highest water rates in the country because of our emergency kind of financial state for water that they couldn't even drink. And our water rates are still sky high, and people are getting shutoffs and losing their homes because they can't pay for water, a basic human right. So our pipes are being replaced, which is a good thing, and we're hoping to be really a model in the nation. We have jobs that are in Flint because of this pipe replacement. Jobs are a big part of our recovery as well. And then my everyday, since the recognition of the water crisis, since the recognition of this widespread trauma, this population-wide lead exposure, my focus has been the tomorrows of the kids. We can't take this away. It's a permanent, irreversible neurotoxin. There's no magic pill that I can give these kids. But there is so much that we can do to build resilience in children. And we are leaning on the incredible science of brain development and childhood resilience to make sure that we do not see the consequence of this crisis. And that is another way that the lessons that we learn in Flint can be shared everywhere, because there's kids everywhere in toxic environments, places of extreme poverty and injustice and loss of democracy. So we're really hoping to share what we're doing. A few examples. So early literacy. So books, maybe not my book, but children's books. Books are brain food for children. In places like Flint, there's about one book for every 300 kids. Imagine that. One book for every 300 kids. By the time our kids reach the age of 3, they have heard 30 million less words. Imagine that. And by 18 months, we already see evidence of that achievement gap that when they start kindergarten, it's almost impossible to bridge. And this is even before the water crisis. So we have made massive investments in early literacy. Book kids in Flint, every month get a book in the mail. From 0 to 5, kids now get a book in the mail. Huge expansion of Reach Out and Read, which was actually born here in New York, which is an evidence-based, clinic-based literacy program with her mom. With her mom, Reach Out and Read. Round of applause for her mom. Awesome. The NBA Players Association, so the Basketball Players Union, is funding a newborn literacy program. So babies born at the hospital, we now give them books and development tools and sign them up for these awesome programs. This is just one example of awesome that is happening that we hope to share with others.
So questions for Dr. Mona? Oh, yes, ma'am. I think there's a microphone coming.
Just a couple of short questions. How much damage did the governor of Michigan do? Because I understand he played a big part in changing the water supply. And last year I went to Michael Moore's show, and part of the show is that he devoted a lot of time to raising, awareness of Flint, and I was wondering if he was at all helpful.
Sure. So the governor was in charge of Flint. So we were under state-appointed emergency management. The emergency manager reports to the governor. So the buck stopped there. In terms of Michael Moore's been awesome. He's elevated the issue. He read my art. He read my book in like 2 days. Wrote a really beautiful blurb. He's come back to Flint. He actually recently came back to Flint and filled these massive water trucks with Flint water and sprayed it at the governor's at the Capitol. And he also sprayed it at Nestle. So Nestle has a base of operations in Flint. The same week that the state cut off our bottled water supply, they gave Nestle an unlimited permit to draw Great Lakes water for like $200 a year, the very same week. So Michael Moore raised some noise about that too.
Amen. Other questions? Oh gosh.
Sounds like you're pediatrician activist and also educator. And I'm curious in terms of, I think all pediatricians through medical education, the typical education is just learning about the body and learning how to treat kids. What are you doing in terms of the next generation of pediatricians? Because it sounds like you want them to be not just healers, but activists. I mean, you talk about that, but can you make the change on a national level?
Absolutely. So my real job is I'm a pediatric residency director. So I oversee the training of pediatric residents in Flint, and it's affiliated with Michigan State University. So I have made this purposeful decision to teach because I can go out and be an advocate, but it's much more important to train the next generation of folks who could solve the next Flints and identify these issues. So I have focused my training of future pediatricians to really embrace the concepts of not only medicine, but also public health. They're not silos, and especially in pediatrics, because everything that we do in pediatrics is prevention. So we actually just recently opened our pediatric clinic, which Chelsea came to. It's on the second floor of a farmer's market. It's the only pediatric clinic that we know of that is co-located in a farmer's market. And we made that environmental move on purpose because we have no full-service grocery stores in Flint. I used to tell my patients, oh, you should eat avocado and kale, and they would just stare at me because where are they going to get avocado and kale? Because in a city that birthed cars, we have terrible transportation burdens and no grocery stores. So we made that conscious decision to move our clinic, a beautiful, beautiful clinic, at a place where they can get fresh food. And every kid that comes to clinic gets a nutrition prescription that they fill downstairs for fruits and veggies. We also have a social worker who's in our clinic that can help address all those other social determinants of health. We have a WIC office in our clinic. We have integrated mental health. We have breastfeeding support. When my new doctors start, I kind of deflate their ego. I'm like, do you know that only like 10 to 15% of medicine actually improves outcomes, health outcomes, contributes to health outcomes? It's all the environmental stuff. So we screen for poverty and we screen for blood pressure. We screen for housing instability and we screen for what have you. So it is a different way of training pediatricians, which is essential.
Well, and one of the things that really struck me, in Dr. Mona's book, is she talks about how she's architected that like quite thoughtfully, kind of from having community rotations that the residents do, from the reading lists that you give your residents that are not just kind of around kind of the newest medical research, but also about the history of Flint. Have other residency programs or medical schools reached out to you? So how do you try to hopefully inject this more systems level kind of thinking, pedagogy, training into other schools and residency programs?
Yeah, I think pediatrics has always thought this way. We actually there's a specialty called community pediatrics where this is more of your focus area, but it's growing everywhere. There's a demand, and that demand is actually coming from the learners. It's coming from medical students who are coming in and saying, "I want public health training. I want to know about my community. I want to live in my community. I just don't want to drive in and out of work. I want to be part of that community, and I want to stand shoulder to shoulder with our community and improve outcomes." So it is changing. There's also this growing recognition of, for example, community-informed work and community participatory research, and that's everything that we do in Flint is hand in hand with community. We actually have a parent partners group for our work where parents advise us on our work. We have a youth advisory council where kids are telling us what's important to them and what they want us to work on as well. Yeah.
Right, other questions? Oh, yes, ma'am.
Jane Goodall wrote in a book about the food supply that the more we buy bottled water, the more those companies are going to get kickbacks and ease of regulations, and that it's more dangerous than letting the government supply the water. So what do you think about that?
That's a great question. So last year was the first year that bottled water actually outsold soda in the country. And it was largely because of the Flint water crisis, because of the huge demand for bottled water, not only in Flint, because everywhere people began concerned about, is my water okay too? So there was a huge increase in the use of bottled water. If your water is properly filtered and that filter is properly maintained, what you get from your water supply is probably okay, but maybe not. What I have learned, and I wasn't kind of naive to start, is that the regulations, the rules on the book that protect drinking water are weak. Especially in regards to lead in the water. There's something called the lead and copper rule. It hasn't been updated for years. It has not caught up with the science of no safe level of lead. The action level for a water system for lead is set at 15 parts per billion, and it has nothing to do with health. It's just what's feasible for water utilities. Whereas, the American Academy of Pediatrics says it should be like 1 part per billion. So there's a lot of the rules on the books and the regulations that have yet to catch up with the science of where they need to be. And it's even more concerning in this day and age, especially with what's happening in the EPA, if they will ever catch up with the science. So if you are worried and you want to take precautions, I recommend kind of asking questions, being awake, being alert, getting educated, being informed, digging deep. And finding out, what is in your water and what's the best way to protect you and your family.
Dr. Mona, if the federal government, particularly under this administration, is abrogating its responsibility to try to catch up with the science, do you see any states or counties kind of at a more kind of local level that are more commensurate with what the science says, like no lead in water?
Absolutely. So Michigan just passed last week a model lead and copper rule. It goes above and beyond the federal standard. And this can be done in other cities and other counties and other states as we wait for the federal government to protect public health.
And it has a pretty short time scale, too.
Yeah, so it's mandating lead pipe replacement for the next, I think, 20 years for all of the lead pipes in Michigan to replace, which is amazing, and also decreasing the standard, the action level for lead and water.
Other questions? Oh, yes.
We have time for about 2 more questions tonight. We'll take our first right over here.
So when I read J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, he talks about kids who have Mountain Dew teeth, for example, in certain regions. Do those children need to wait for a Dr. Mona, or are there ways to fix that too? From somebody from the outside, or do you have a vision of that?
So I didn't hear everything, but something about rural kids. Do they need to wait for Dr. Mona? So they can contact me. No, just kidding. There's amazing folks everywhere who want to be involved, who want to get involved in communities, and who want to serve. I was part of the March for Science last year, and there's so many academics and doctors and professors who are so cozy in their clinics and in their classrooms and their universities, and they've almost become scared to come out into the communities. And the whole kind of movement of that March for Science was like, hey, you need to get out there. You need to start working hand in hand with your communities and start making a difference. And that's ultimately why people go into medicine, because they want to serve, and why that's the purpose of science, is to make communities better. So they're out there. They may need a little push them. Keep pushing them. Knock on their doors. The purpose of science is not to publish journals and to get promoted. The purpose is to improve our communities. So those people are there. Just keep pushing.
I guess maybe in the back.
So you alarmed me about our New York water and conditions. What would you suggest we can do? Whether it's advocacy or currently put some kind of a filter into our homes?
Yeah,
What should we do?
so New York does have the most lead pipes in the country, then Chicago, and I think Detroit is third. If there is optimized corrosion control in place, then things should be okay. However, if you have a pregnant mom or a child under the age of 5, I would recommend using a lead clearing filter. They're not all lead clearing filters. So your Brita pitcher filter is not necessarily a lead clearing filter. You have to make sure it's something called NSF 53 lead certified clearing filter, and you can look them up. But if you want to protect your children the most, especially during that most developmentally vulnerable age group, really that prenatal to preschool period, I would consider getting a lead clearing filter. Yeah, so it's an NSF, the National Science Foundation, 53 lead clearing filter. You can't get like a whole house filter. It has to attach to the faucet. It has to be at the very last point where the water comes out, because there's lead throughout our premise plumbing. So we didn't restrict lead into our service lines, which are the water lines. This might be too wonky. For our water lines that go from our main, the water main to your home, until 1986. But we didn't restrict lead in our brass fixtures until 2014. So there's lead in all of our plumbing. It was used in solder and throughout the inside of our plumbing. So to take the most precautions, you should use a filter that is attached right to the faucet, right before the water comes out. And there's other things you could do. You can flush your water. Always use cold water from your tap. If you've had periods of non-use of water, like more than 6 hours or so, flush your water before you drink from it.
You should explain what flushing is if
So
people don't
just
know.
run it for a few minutes. Just put it on cold until it gets super, super cold, and then you know you have the water from the main when it's super, super cold. That gets rid of all the sediment that's within your system. You never use hot water for cooking or drinking. And I didn't even know that. When my kids were little and I made the macaroni and cheese, I used hot water because it boiled faster and it made the noodles faster. But hot water leaches lead out of plumbing more, which is another reason that kids' lead levels increase over the summer. So you should never use hot water for cooking and drinking. So these are basic things that you can do. Flushing, run your water before you use it, never use hot water, and put a filter in place, especially if you have a pregnant mom or a child under the age of 5. Absolutely, it's hazardous for everybody. So lead impacts almost every organ system. It impacts every age group. In adults, it's been associated with early dementia, with cardiovascular disease, kidney problems, gout. It impacts almost every organ system. However, our children are the most developmentally vulnerable, and they have the longest kind of life course trajectory. I'm often at these kind of events in Flint, and people are like, well, what about my pets? So the pets are also vulnerable, and the pets, like in most environmental health disasters, are often the first to be exposed because they're lower to the ground, they're closer to the environment. They were also drinking water from non-potable water sources, so from like the laundry tub sink or the hose where there's more lead in those products. So a lot of our animals got sick. MSU came in with their vet school and did animal testing and also showed an increase in the animals' lead levels.
Well, on that pragmatic note, but also I would argue on the optimistic note, because we all can do something.
Absolutely.
I do hope that you will read Dr. Mona's book. It is superbly well written. It is a kind of masterful intertwining of her family's history, which we didn't have the chance to talk about today, the history of our country, the history of Flint, and a clarion call to action for all of us, because we all failed the kids of Flint, and I would argue we all need to do everything we can to try to help repair that damage and to protect children everywhere, including, since I'm sitting here shamelessly, those currently being ripped away from their parents on our border. So we all need to keep using our voices and our platforms. We need to recognize and celebrate our heroes, because Dr. Mona, you're not going to convince me that you're not one of my heroes. I have claimed you. I am keeping you. I'm here to support you, and I am just so profoundly grateful that we have people in the world like you and that we have you. So thank you so much for coming. Please buy her book, share it with your friends, and thank you so much, Barnes & Noble.